For 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty ruled Russia, and for much of that time, they ruled with an iron fist. They seemed untouchable, a dynasty forged in power and seemingly destined to last forever. They commanded a staggering 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, an empire of immense diversity and resources. Their wealth was the stuff of legend, their authority absolute, backed by a feared secret police and the divine right of kings. To the outside world, the Russian Empire of the early 20th century looked like a colossal, unshakable giant. But this giant had feet of clay. For decades, just beneath the gilded surface of autocracy, immense pressures were building. Deep-seated social inequality, widespread poverty, and a desperate hunger for freedom created a dangerously volatile foundation. And by 1917, the First World War would shatter that foundation, turning simmering discontent into a revolutionary firestorm that consumed an empire and redrew the map of the 20th century. So, how did it all come crashing down in a matter of months? What pushed a nation of over 150 million people to their absolute breaking point? And how did Tsar Nicholas II, one of the wealthiest men in the world, a ruler seen by many as a father figure appointed by God, lose it all? This wasn't a simple palace coup. It was a perfect storm, a deadly combination of military blunders, political incompetence, and overwhelming social fury. Let's unravel the cataclysmic chain of events that forced the last Tsar of Russia from his throne, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule and setting the stage for the world's first communist state. The crumbling pillars of autocracy. To get why the Tsar fell, you have to understand the man himself and the system he was so desperate to protect. Nicholas II took the throne in 1894, believing, just like his ancestors, in his absolute, God-given right to rule. He was a devoted family man, but as a leader, he was indecisive, allergic to change, and tragically out of touch with his troubled empire. While much of Europe was tiptoeing towards democracy, Nicholas clung to the principles of autocracy, a system where one man held all the power. This refusal to reform was a critical weakness. The Industrial Revolution was creating a new working class in the cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. These workers faced appalling conditions, overcrowded slums, grueling 12-hour workdays, and no political rights whatsoever. In the countryside, where most Russians lived, things were just as grim. Serfdom had been abolished, but peasants were still trapped in poverty, riddled with debt, and farming tiny plots of land with ancient tools. The first major crack in the regime appeared in 1905. Russia's humiliating defeat in a war with Japan sent shockwaves through the nation, exposing just how incompetent the government was. On a freezing January day, the discontent boiled over. A crowd of over 100,000 unarmed workers and their families, led by a priest named Father Gapon, marched peacefully to the Tsar's winter palace. They carried icons and portraits of Nicholas, their little father, hoping to deliver a petition begging for better conditions and basic rights. Nicholas, however, wasn't in the city. Instead, troops were ordered to fire on the crowd. Hundreds were killed in what became known as Bloody Sunday. The massacres shattered the myth of a benevolent Tsar. Outrage swept across the empire, igniting strikes and uprisings that became the 1905 revolution. Facing a total collapse of his authority, Nicholas was forced to make concessions. He issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and creating an elected parliament, the Duma. For a moment, it seemed like Russia might be on the path to a constitutional monarchy. But it was a false dawn. Nicholas fundamentally distrusted the Duma and clipped its wings at every opportunity. His prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, tried a two-pronged approach: ruthless repression of revolutionaries. The hangman's noose was grimly nicknamed Stolypin's necktie, and a series of land reforms. But the reforms were too slow and Stolypin was assassinated in 1911. By 1914, the autocracy had clawed back control, but the core problems hadn't gone away. The trust between the ruler and the ruled was broken. The empire was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark was the First World War. The Great War and the Great Collapse. When war broke out in 1914, a wave of patriotism initially swept Russia, uniting the nation behind the Tsar. But it didn't last. The war would be the final, fatal stress test for the Tsarist state, exposing every single one of its weaknesses. The Russian army, the largest in the world, was called a steamroller, but that was in name only. Russian soldiers fought with incredible bravery, but they were often poorly equipped and abysmally led. Horror stories filtered back from the front of men being sent into battle without rifles, told to just grab one from a fallen comrade. The Eastern Front became a catastrophic slaughter. By 1915, Russian forces had suffered devastating defeats and were in a full, chaotic retreat. It was right then that Tsar Nicholas II made a truly disastrous decision. In September 1915, he fired his commanders and took personal command of the army. This move was a disaster for two reasons. First, it personally tied the Tsar to every single military failure in the eyes of the people. Every defeat was now his defeat. Second, it left the government back in the capital, Petrograd, in the hands of his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra. This was, politically, a complete disaster. Alexandra, a German princess, was already deeply distrusted, and now many accused her of treason. Worse, she was under the spell of Grigory Rasputin, a controversial Siberian mystic who seemed to be the only one who could ease her son's hemophilia. With the Tsar away, Rasputin's influence over the government exploded. Competent ministers were fired and replaced by his cronies. This ministerial leapfrog paralyzed the government and fueled rumors of a dark, corrupt force controlling the throne. The monarchy's credibility was utterly destroyed. In December 1916, a group of nobles murdered Rasputin, hoping to save the monarchy from itself. It was too little, too late. While the government disintegrated, the war was devastating the home front. The economy buckled. Millions of male peasants were drafted, crippling agriculture. The railways were choked with military transports, so food and fuel couldn't get to the cities. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, Russia was in a full-blown crisis. In the cities, food was scarce and prices skyrocketed. Long bread lines became a daily, desperate ritual. Factories, starved of coal, shut down, leaving thousands jobless. At the front, morale hit rock bottom. By 1917, the army was hemorrhaging soldiers, with desertion skyrocketing to an estimated 1.5 million. The social contract was broken. Completely. The stage was set. The February Revolution. Bread and peace. The final collapse didn't start with a grand political plan, but with a spontaneous cry of desperation. On February 23, 1917, International Women's Day, thousands of women in Petrograd took to the streets protesting severe food shortages. They were soon joined by striking factory workers. The crowds surged through the city, their chants changing from "We want bread" to "Down with the autocracy" and "Down with the war." Over the next few days, the protests exploded into a general strike that paralyzed the city. Nicholas, still at military headquarters, was told of the unrest but totally failed to grasp its severity. He sent his usual order: crush it. On February 26th, some troops did fire on the crowds, killing dozens. But then, the unthinkable happened. The next day, soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, mostly recent conscripts who were fed up and felt more kinship with the protesters than their officers, began to mutiny. They shot their officers and poured into the streets, joining the very revolution they were supposed to suppress. Revolutionaries seized public buildings and railway stations. Tsarist authority in the capital simply evaporated. In the chaos, two rival bodies tried to fill the void. One was the Provisional Government, formed by moderate leaders from the Duma. The other was the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers. This created a shaky, dual power, where the Provisional Government had official authority, but the Soviet had the real power on the streets. Meanwhile, the Tsar himself was trying to get back to the capital, but revolutionary railway workers stopped his train. Stranded and isolated, he received frantic telegrams from his generals. They all said the same thing: it's hopeless. To save the country from civil war, he had to abdicate. Realizing he'd lost everyone's support, Nicholas gave in. And so, on March 2, 1917, with a strange, fatalistic calm, he signed the abdication manifesto. His brother Michael was offered the crown but wisely refused it. And just like that, over 300 years of Romanov rule came to a stunningly abrupt end. The Tsar had lost his throne. But the revolution was far from over. The war was still raging, people were still starving, and the provisional government made a fatal mistake. They decided to keep fighting. This decision alienated almost everyone and created a perfect opening for a more radical group with a much clearer slogan. Peace, land, and bread. The Bolsheviks were waiting in the wings. The path to October: Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The 8 months between February and October 1917 were a dizzying whirlwind of political chaos. The dual power arrangement was never going to work. The provisional government was losing support fast. And into this volatile mix stepped one of history's most determined revolutionaries, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, leader of the radical Bolsheviks, had been in exile. The Germans, hoping he'd cause more chaos in Russia, helped him travel home in a sealed train. When he arrived in Petrograd in April, he gave a blistering speech. In what became known as the April Theses, Lenin rejected any cooperation with the provisional government. His program was as clear as it was radical: an immediate end to the war, all power to the Soviets, and land to the peasants. His slogans, peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets, were exactly what people wanted to hear. At first, many thought Lenin was too extreme. But as the summer dragged on, the government's failures drove more and more people to his side. A disastrous new military offensive in June led to hundreds of thousands of casualties, and soldiers began deserting in droves. Back in Petrograd, this sparked massive, armed demonstrations known as the July Days. The government cracked down, and for a second, it looked like the Bolsheviks had missed their chance. But then came the Kornilov affair in August. A conservative general, Lav Kornilov, tried to march on Petrograd to establish a military dictatorship. In a panic, Prime Minister Kerensky was forced to ask the very people he just suppressed for help: the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolsheviks. They brilliantly organized the city's defense, and the coup collapsed without a shot being fired in the capital. The real winners? The Bolsheviks. They had saved the revolution. Their popularity soared. With the government in shambles, Lenin, still in hiding, decided it was time. From his hiding place, he bombarded his party with demands for an armed insurrection. History, he wrote, will not forgive us if we do not assume power now. Under the meticulous planning of Leon Trotsky, the Bolsheviks prepared to take power. On the night of October 24th, Red Guard units began systematically seizing key points in Petrograd: bridges, telephone exchanges, railway stations. The takeover was swift and remarkably bloodless in the capital. The provisional government was helpless. By the next evening, Bolshevik forces stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the remaining ministers. That same night, Lenin emerged from hiding, strode to the podium at the Congress of Soviets, and declared simply, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." The October Revolution was over. The Bolsheviks were in charge. Conclusion: the fall of Tsar Nicholas II wasn't because of one single mistake, but a whole catastrophic cascade of them. This was a revolution born from a century of unresolved pressures, brought to a violent head by the immense strain of the First World War. An autocratic ruler who refused to adapt, a corrupt political system, and profound inequality created a society ripe for upheaval. The war was the catalyst that exposed the regime's incompetence, shattered the economy, and brutalized a generation that finally refused to sacrifice anymore. The Tsar's abdication wasn't the end of the story. It opened a power vacuum that the well-meaning but ineffective provisional government couldn't fill. Their decision to stay in the war sealed their doom. In the end, power didn't fall to the moderates. It fell to the one group that had a clear, simple, and radical message: Lenin's Bolsheviks, who promised the people what they desperately craved: peace, land, and bread. The story of how the Tsar lost his throne isn't just about a fallen dynasty. It's a powerful and chilling lesson in how a perfect storm of military disaster, political blindness, and social fury can bring even the mightiest of empires crashing down. If you found this dive into the Russian Revolution interesting, give this video a like and subscribe for more stories from history. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next upload. And let us know in the comments, what part of this whole revolutionary saga do you find the most fascinating? Thanks for watching.